See if I can hear it okay. The goal of today is going to be talking about how to utilize the ABN, the Advanced Beneficiary Notice of Non-Coverage, when you're delivering telehealth services to a Medicare beneficiary. Now, if you guys haven't seen the post, I would not be sharing this if I hadn't seen the post shared by both Nancy Beckley and Rick Yawanda. Sorry, Rick, I still can't say your last name. Regarding telehealth. And let's make some clarifications right now. So telehealth is not an e-visit. An e-visit is not telehealth. They are mutually exclusive. Don't confuse the two. This is specific to telehealth. In an e-visit, you're not providing therapeutic exercise and therapeutic activity, and you're not billing CPT codes through an e-visit. An e-visit at this point, from what we understand, has 3 CPT codes based on time. There's a 7-day envelope around the total amount of time. We're still looking for clarification on that, but as it stands, from my understanding, and Rick or Nancy, please correct me if I'm wrong, the e-visit is for a 7-day period, and we believe you take the total number of of minutes during the 7-day period, and you bill one of the 3 corresponding codes. This YouTube Live is about the ABN and how to utilize the ABN and what the language is around the ABN. So let's begin at the source. Thank you, Nancy. CMS.gov. If you go to FFS ABN, you go to this page, and I'll post this link. I'll put it in the YouTube video description. It'll take you here. We're going to use this Medicare Processing Manual, Chapter 30, which is this right here. Then you can see revision 11119, 3819. This is the most current one that I have found. So, and this is what they reference on the CMS website. Sorry, I just lost my feed for a second. So let's take a look at what we've got here. If we scroll down to section 50, this is the main information regarding the ABN. I'm going to zoom in here a little bit. I'm on a little bit of a time crunch because my boys are out there and they're going to bust in here any minute. My wife went for a run, and so I'm going to take advantage. When we're looking at general statutory authority, you've got this information. What I want to cover today is 50.3, the ABN scope. There's a mandatory ABN use, and there's a voluntary ABN use. I'm going to jump to the voluntary ABN use first, because what this is saying is ABNs are not required for care that is either statutorily excluded from coverage under Medicare or most care that fails to meet the technical benefit requirement. Statutorily excluded is what we're focusing on for this conversation, and that's what Rick and Nancy came together to confirm for us, is that telehealth delivered by PTOT SLP is a statutorily excluded service. That means we can utilize a voluntary ABN, but what does that mean? What's a mandatory ABN? So I'm going to take a step back and let's look at a mandatory ABN. So in mandatory is when a service is not medically necessary. You guys hear me talk about constantly how Medicare can be an amazing lead generation tool. It can get people into your network, into your ecosystem, and then you have the opportunity, if it benefits the individual beneficiary, to provide non-covered services. And I've got loads of content on all that. But you would issue a mandatory ABN when it's not reasonable and necessary. Then they have examples of that I'll get to in a moment. There's some other information in here about mandatory. The other one about a mandatory ABN that I don't hear enough people talk about is when outpatient services are in excess of, they still use the term cap, we're going to use the term financial threshold, and don't qualify for the exception. Now, I would say this would be a situation where it's no longer medically necessary. Maybe the beneficiary wants to continue to work with you, but it's not medically necessary. It also does not qualify for the KX modifier. You would issue and utilize a mandatory ABN. There's some, more information in here. I highly recommend you guys look at this source document, read it, understand it, generate questions from it, and then bring those questions into the group and we'll talk about it. So the language is really important, right? A notifier. What's a notifier? These entities include physicians, practitioners, providers, suppliers, and or utilization review committee for the care provider. I'm always a big believer in you have to understand the terminology, because Medicare CMS terminology doesn't always coincide with our lay terminology. So the recipient of the ABN, representative of the beneficiary, all of this information is going to be super important for you to review. But I wanted to jump down here to triggering events. So they break it down into 3 categories: at the initiation, at the reduction of services, and at termination. So termination is pretty simple, and this brings an opportunity here where, potentially patients that were ready for discharge but want to continue working with you prior to the lockdown. They give a great example. So Mrs. X has been receiving covered outpatient speech therapy, but this can be OT or PT, has met her treatment goals, has been given a home exercise program that does not require a therapist. Mrs. X wants her speech therapist to continue to work with her, even though continued therapy is not medically necessary. Mrs. X is issued an ABN prior to her speech therapist resuming therapy that is no longer considered medically necessary and reasonable. So this would be your classic continuity program, right? For decades, we've had that in place. Hopefully, everybody's familiar with this. Patient finishes formal therapy. They want to keep working with you. They have the freedom to hire you on a self-pay basis because the covered services have been completed. This is when you issue an ABN. At the reduction of services, this one's less common, but I think it has a very important role. So another example, Mr. T is receiving outpatient therapy 5 days a week, and after meeting several of his goals, therapy is reduced to 3 days a week. A normal plan of care, right? We would all agree with that. Mr. T wants to achieve a higher level of proficiency in performing goal-related activities and wants to continue with 5 days. He's willing to take financial responsibility for the cost of 2 additional days that are no longer reasonable or necessary. You give him an ABN. We'll talk about the instructions, so stay with me. I'll show you how to fill out the ABN. But you issue the ABN, he pays out of pocket for 2 days, you continue formal therapy for the other 3, and then what? So then maybe in 2 weeks, he's paying for 3 days, you continue therapy for 2, and then he pays for 4, you continue for 1, and so on. You get the idea. But all this misconception and false belief around Medicare beneficiaries are never allowed to pay out of pocket. This is in the CMS guidelines. This is not my opinion. This is referenced and documented. So when you're developing your internal policies and procedures, which you're required to have, you have to reference these source documents. This is how you make those decisions. And then, of course, at the initiation, Mrs. S, this is a really important one, asks her physician for an EKG. Remember, this isn't just therapy. This is across the spectrum. She's asking for an EKG because her sister was recently diagnosed with AFib. Mrs. S has no diagnosis that warrants medical necessity for an EKG, but she insists on having one, is willing to pay out of pocket for it. The physician's office personnel issues the ABN, so Mrs. S signs it and fills it out before the EKG happens. So what is this like? This, in a normal scenario, would be, you had a patient that you've seen in the past. The patient knows you, is familiar with you. They're not really having problems, or maybe they even are, but it's a little kink in the neck. It's nothing out of the ordinary, and they're like, hey, Tony, I woke up with a kink in my neck. I need to see you. Can you get me in today? And so you determine that it's not medically necessary. It's going to resolve on its own. There's no major concerns or issues. There's no physician of record. None of this other stuff's going on. But the patient is adamant about seeing you, and you're confident that you can provide non-covered service. Okay, we issue the ABN. We get it set up. I would say this would be a situation kind of more similar to what we're experiencing now. Whether it be a patient that's already been receiving care or a new patient who's reaching out to you, you inform them that this is not a covered service because it's telehealth with a PTOT SLP. Medicare does not pay for this, so you issue the ABN, and let's get into the actual form. So back on this website, you can see that down at the bottom we have the ABN Form Instructions. You have it in Spanish and in English, and you have an example. Let me see what this looks like. I'm going to pop that open. Even though this is for labs, this still kind of gives you a little bit of an example of what it might look like. So the instructions, they're super user-friendly. They're easy to follow. I'm going to zoom in here a little bit so you guys can see better. So completing the ABN, you download the form, talks about the different sections. Here are 10 blanks. There are 10 blanks in the notice. And then it goes like section number 1, A through J. If we look at the form, we've got A, B, C, D, E, F. It goes all the way down. And some of the things for you to consider when you're filling this out. Remember, this is a lab version. But there's going to be a section here where, let me see if I can find it for you guys in the instructions. So header A through C, it's going to be the notifier, then the patient name, identification number. Then in the body, you're going to have this. The following descriptors may be used. So what's the item? What's the service? Like, in your situation, it might be 97161, 162, 163. It might be 97110, 97530. Your CPT codes are in there. The little description of the procedure. Read through this information. I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to be able to get through it all. The reason why Medicare will not pay. And this could be something as simple as Medicare, this is a I can't even say it. Excluded service, non-covered service through Medicare. Medicare does not pay for telehealth delivered by a PTOT SLP. That is your reason. We want to put estimated costs on there. What are you going to be charging? And you can see for the service, you can lump it together. You can break out individual codes if you're not sure what you're going to be doing. And they talk about that in this section. Now, down here, in terms of which option they are going to choose, this could use some clarification from either Nancy or Rick if they would be willing to. If this is an optional ABN that we're using, this doesn't have to be completed. If it's a mandatory ABN we're using, this would be completed. And basically what you've got is option 1 is a situation in which you're going to continue to submit claims to Medicare. You're expecting those claims to be denied. You're going to put a modifier on the claim form, and I'll grab those modifiers another time. Option 2 is the most common scenario where you're saying this is not going to be covered. There is no opportunity for an appeal, right? This is the beneficiary saying they want the right to appeal Medicare if Medicare denies. This is the beneficiary saying, I know I can't appeal, but I still want this service and I'm willing to pay out of pocket. No claim will be filed with Medicare. And then, of course, option number 3, which doesn't apply to our situation, is the beneficiary does not want the service. They're telling you and they're telling Medicare they don't want the service. They're not going to pay and they don't want to bill. So these instructions, I don't know, very few people actually take the time to look at this. Everybody throws the term ABN around. Please take a minute, look at these instructions, signature boxes. Again, a voluntary ABN does not need to be signed by the beneficiary, but it's you give the beneficiary a copy of it. I keep a copy for me internally. So So guys, I'm out of time. I'm sorry. I'm trying to get you the content as I can, but hopefully tonight I can jump on for another YouTube live. In the meantime, if you have questions about this form, specifically utilization of this form, anything like that, share it. I would appreciate it if you shared it in the comments of the video on YouTube. I'll share it into the group, but I'm trying to build some traffic to the YouTube channel. So of course, if you can subscribe, watch more videos, get your questions to me, and I'll get my best answers available.